Hey everyone, how are you? This is Making the Movement on the Move. Welcome back to the OurSociety Experiment and our latest candidate conversation. I'm here with Madeline Hoffman, who's running for Senate in the state of New Jersey here. Madeline, thank you so much for hanging out with us today.
Oh, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. So in the past, Madeline, you've run for office before.
Yes.
You've run for governor before.
Yes.
I believe you ran for
Vice President.
Vice President, right?
Yes.
Ralph Nader, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And that was in the late 1990s. So now it's 2018. You're running for Senate.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about why you're running?
Well, I'm running because I feel there was a need for me to run. I feel that there's a need for alternative political parties, that the Republicans and Democrats have kind of messed things up over time, and they continue to do so. And part of the reason is the amount of money that has been authorized basically, or allowed, permitted to flow from large corporations, political action committees, into the legislative process. And so we have a situation where the Democrats are in one corner and the Republicans are in the other, and they fight. They fight all the time, and they are fighting to do the best for their big donors. They're not fighting in order to protect or do something that will benefit you and me and the 99%, if you want to use the language from the Occupy movement. So I'm running because I want to expose that. I want to challenge that, and I think there are some very important issues around which that needs to happen. Also running because when I ran in the late 1990s, I found that it was a really good way to connect with people and to try to connect people. Say when I ran for New Jersey governor, people who are working for affordable housing, people who are working for a clean environment, people who are fighting against or working for peace, people who are concerned about auto insurance rates and LGBTQ issues and the like. It was a way to it was a vehicle that I could use to try to bring these folks together. May not have known each other, may not have thought that they shared concerns on similar issues, but it was so exciting to see that happen. And so running as a Green, I can be principled. I'm not beholden to corporate money or PAC money. I can connect with people from various constituencies, various movements, and the idea is to build a green wave as an alternative to what we see going on out there. And I'm very excited to do it. I feel very fortunate that I can do it because that was 20 years ago, and my life has taken all kinds of twists and turns. And I was working for a nonprofit peace organization for the last 20 years, or a little less than that. And I thought, I had to be nonpartisan in that position. So I kind of thought my electoral days and running for office days were done, but they're not.
Okay, fair. Now, that's actually really interesting. You mentioned that you worked for nonprofits, including you were the executive director of 2 different nonprofits, right?
Correct.
It was if I'm correct, it was the Grassroots Environmental Organization.
That's correct, yes.
And the New Jersey Peace Action Organization,
correct,
essentially. So, how does your experience as an executive director of 2 separate nonprofits, how does that translate into being a senator? Like, what skills do you take from that and bring into a position that you're running for?
Well, that's a really good question. Nobody's ever asked me that question before. But for the 18 years or so that I was working for the Grassroots Environmental Organization, I was working with citizens groups and community groups and even environmental commissions of local municipalities. And so the idea of working with them was to understand who had power. So if it was a proposal to build a garbage incinerator in their county, like for Newark, for example, or for Camden, or for Warren County, out in rural Warren County, it was important for people to understand who made the decisions and how they made the decisions, what was the process, and then how many different ways could the community get involved to try to affect and change the direction of that decision. And so we paired people from Newark with people from Warren County because they were both fighting the same kind of proposal, but one is an urban area and one is rural, and another would be suburban. And so, so the skills learned were decision-making process, who's in charge and who needs the pressure, what the main issues were and how it would affect people in any part of the state, but also how perhaps in the city there would be a kind of weighted, more such polluting facilities built in urban cities than in suburban areas with money.
Sure.
So you kind of learn how the political landscape. You also have to think of the big picture, because if you said, okay, we don't want a garbage incinerator built in Newark, or we don't want at-sea incineration built in Newark, or we don't want a hazardous waste incinerator built in Newark. Okay then, so what do you want? And so we were able to, in building coalitions like that, we were able to put forward a broader vision, a more sustainable economic and environmental vision for how you deal with garbage and toxic waste. So it would be, let's reuse, recycle, and reduce our waste. Let's compost. Let's figure out what the alternative is. For hazardous waste, how can a manufacturer change its processes so that they produce less hazardous waste? How do you can you control emissions from a stack? So I had to learn science, had to learn politics, had to learn the decision-making process, and you put all that together for an almost 20-year period of time. A lot of hands-on experience I had working with the political system, or trying to make the political system work for communities.
Sure. So you were doing a lot of organizing, it sounds like, with solution-oriented, like with ends in mind. Did you find, I am curious, because you mentioned like Newark and Camden, that a lot of these projects that got started with, for example, trash, are they typically targeted to like urban areas that can't really defend themselves because they don't have the equity or the capital to defend themselves and the knowledge of the process, so to speak?
Yes, and I want to go back to the peace issues as well, and I want to leave those on the table. But yes, to answer that question, towards the end, around 1998, when I was still working on these issues, there was a change or a shift in the way a lot of these issues were framed, and it was environmental justice / environmental racism. In other words, was it low to moderate income communities that were being targeted for these kinds of facilities, or was it primarily Black, Latino, other marginalized communities that were being targeted for this? And in fact, yesterday I was canvassing in Collingswood in Camden County, and one of the garbage incinerators we were fighting against was ultimately built in Camden. And so the people who invited me to come down to talk, to speak to the Democratic Socialists and also to hand out literature, they took me on a tour of Camden before that. And I saw the garbage incinerator, which was a kind of, completing a circle moment. And the one person who was hosting this, he lives less than a mile from the incinerator. So I was concerned about him, and I was concerned about that neighborhood and how that incinerator was impacting them. Beautiful, magnificent city hall, and then a methadone clinic right across the way, and abandoned libraries and abandoned lots, and so there's a concern, and that will be something I'm going to be raising in my campaign. What's happened to the cities? Where's the money? Where's the money going? And in a city like Newark, why are private developers being wooed in to push lower income people out of high-rise multifamily apartments, places where they've been living for 30 years, 40 years. So it's going to be, if these projects go through, the people who have been living there for 30 to 40 years will be pushed out. New development will be made, will take place. Much higher income will move in. In Camden, it was really brought home to me because the people I was with took me past the site of the old high school in Camden, and that old high school had been there for 92 years, and it was knocked down just at the end of the school year in June. And
They knocked down a high school?
Yeah.
They built a new one?
Not yet. And there's concerns because it's going to be a state-of-the-art modern building. The concern is, oh yes, and I wonder who's going to go to that school. What kinds of people will be brought in to go to that school. It's not about the building. I mean, if there was more money for education, for public education, and if there was local control of public education, that would never happen. This is outside developers, private, probably with an eye to gentrifying, bringing in higher income people. So all these issues are interconnected, and so yes, I learned those kinds of things working for the grassroots environmental organization, and then the last 18 years I've been working for a nonprofit peace organization, and you see the connections, how money is drained out of communities, and the communities that need the money the most are usually the Newarks, the Camdens, the Trentons, the low to moderate working class communities, not the suburbs. Of course, they need money, but their property taxes fund it. If you take $717 billion, that's billion with a B, you take that out of the treasury and spend it on war, that's $717 billion that our communities no longer have.
So to your point about, because that's something to dive into, I know it's a big part of your platform on OurSociety, you have something about on your OurSociety profile, you have something about peace, and that's like a big focus of one of your core values. So let's kind of dive into that a little bit. You talk about the money we're spending on war, and we've been at war now, what was it, been 17 years?
Well, if you say since 9/11.
Right.
But if you go back, the United States has been at war for all but 27 years of its existence.
Sure, yeah, that's a crazy fact.
So that really brings that home. But yeah, we can look at the last 17 years.
But still, I mean, perpetual war with no end in sight. It's
Correct.
like Vietnam #2. And similar to Vietnam, right? Planning wasn't done correctly, and now it's just that there's really, not only is there no path to victory that I understand, but it doesn't even seem like victory is on the horizon, or any victory that you would say would be an ideal, Westphalian value or the democratic society arising from it. We've splintered the region. So tell us about that, and how, I'm interested to hear, I know you've written about it on your site profile, so I am interested to hear, like, what is your, tell us about your work with the peace organization. Tell us about what plans, if you were elected, right, what you would do to kind of manifest the vision you have for changing the way the U.S. operates in terms of the military-industrial complex.
Well, I shouldn't be laughing because it's not a funny issue.
Yeah.
It's not a funny
It's
issue.
a tremendous, I understand.
It's a huge undertaking, and so, but I'm ready to tackle it.
Sure. And
I have tackled it virtually every day, each and every day, for the last 18 years through June 1st.
Okay.
So when I started working at New Jersey Peace Action, that was before 9/11, and working for peace was difficult enough then. And then you can imagine what happened after the events of 9/11, how difficult it was to speak out for peace when there was such a backlash that occurred. And that backlash has continued today. There might have been sort of a hiatus for a number of years, at least in terms of the harsh rhetoric, but under President Trump that's come right back up again. Under Obama, the rhetoric was not as harsh, but the wars continued. The wars escalated. The drone wars escalated. The anti-Islamic sentiment kind of been pushed to the side, but it was not gone by any means. So yes, and I would like to be the person to replace Senator Menendez in this case, because Senator Menendez, while he opposed the Iraq War going back to 2003 as a representative, after that he has not been a champion for peace, at least on issues of concern to our organization and to the peace movement in general. Right now, one thing I would do instantaneously, immediately, first act, call for the suspension of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. People may know, they may have seen the bombing of a bus filled with school children, mostly under the age of 10, in Yemen. And this was last week. We knew, and then CNN just reported, that the bomb that was used on that bus was manufactured by Lockheed Martin, one of the largest military contractors in the United States. Now, it wasn't a surprise to us because the U.S. has been selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. We sold weapons under President Obama. We've sold them under Donald Trump. And so if we sell weapons, they're going to be used. And Saudi Arabia has been using them in Yemen primarily. And the second part of that equation is that the United States has been refueling Saudi warplanes for quite some time. So we have, if you're going to refuel them, have to have the fuel and the personnel to do that. So we're on the ground in Saudi Arabia as well. And then we also have troops in the port of Hodeidah, which is one of the main ports, main ways that food and other supplies come into Yemen. And most of Yemen, much of Yemen, is on the brink of, if not already, experiencing famine. So I would immediately call for the troops to be withdrawn, the support for Saudi Arabia to be suspended, and there have been many talks or calls for talks, negotiations in the last month or so, and that's what we would need to do. We'd need to have all the interested parties sit down to talk it through, because bombing isn't going to help it. Bombing isn't going to solve anything. Bombing, this killing of 40 children is horrifying and could be considered a war crime. And it's not that it's Saudi Arabia that did it, because Saudi Arabia, it was not only Saudi Arabia that's responsible. The United States has blood on its hands, as well as our senators and House and representatives who year in and year out vote for these huge military budgets that include this kind of money to make the weapons and then sell the weapons. So that's the first thing that I would do.
I just want to ask you a question about that, because that's so obviously you're very passionate about ending war, and I think that's a growing sentiment amongst the populace. But when you talk about Saudi Arabia, correct me if I'm wrong, but we have a deep alliance with them in terms of energy, right? Like they're fossil fuels. Now obviously that's a whole other issue we can get into.
Yes.
But is it feasible to break that agreement without having alternative energy networks ready?
Well, Albert Einstein said you can't simultaneously prepare for peace and prevent war at the same time. In other words, if we are relying on our energy from Saudi Arabia and we're basing our foreign policy on energy from Saudi Arabia, then we're not going to be doing the kinds of things we need to do to create an alternative fuel base. And I just took the No Fossil Fuels pledge, No Fossil Fuels Money pledge a couple of weeks ago, and people may have seen it, the Democratic National Committee said that that's what they were going to do and then reversed themselves. So when we talk about keeping big money out of politics, that's a prime example. If you're because that money, you know, taking money from the fossil fuels industry, that requires you to do the kinds of things that maintain an alliance with Saudi Arabia, because you're not going to be doing as much of the research for an alternative energy, so as you would otherwise. And one of my platform planks is get off of fossil fuels ASAP. So, and you know what you said earlier, I didn't have a chance to address it. You said earlier that these are endless wars, no end in sight. How are you going to define a victory, you know, bringing democracy or whatever it is? I don't think that was the intention of these wars at all. I think the intentions of these wars from the get-go were to maintain, either to get or to maintain control of natural gas resources, oil resources, lithium resources in Afghanistan. Sure. It's about resources. It's about controlling them, not necessarily for people in the United States to benefit, but for the companies that profit off it, and to keep China or Russia or another country from profiting off of that. Remember when we invaded Iraq in 2003, Saddam Hussein had committed the ultimate crime. He was going to sell his oil in euros, buy and sell in euros, which would then prop up the European economy and not prop up the United States economy, which relies a lot on buying and selling of oil.
On the petrodollar.
Yes,
sure.
on the petrodollar. That's a better way to put it. And so we're in that position where, and again, it's why it's important, why I'm running as a socialist, and I'm running as an independent, and I'm running as a green, all as one, because the corporate donors and the corporate interests are at odds with the kind of platform and the kind of policy that we really need. Get ourselves off fossil fuel, then we don't need to go to war. And ironically, you may or may not know this, but the military is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels. So
I didn't know that.
yeah, so I looked at a report done from 2003 or 4 after the Iraq War, 1991 Iraq War, not this one. Was done actually by a Green Party in the UK, and they talked about how more energy was consumed in waging war than was actually being generated by access to those resources. So it's a kind of a net energy loss when you look at it, plus so many people, rightfully so, are concerned about climate change and global warming, and we've had our own experiences this year in New Jersey with heat, and more heat, but people all around the world are experiencing the same thing. And if we're waging in wars for oil and consuming oil in order to do that, the logic escapes me.
So you mentioned two things that we can kind of dive into one after another, but you mentioned environmentalists and you mentioned energy. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your plan for a clean energy solution? So like, what would you do? What bills would you support? How would you implement a different type of energy regime within the U.S.? Like, what would you propose?
Okay, well, let me focus first on the pipelines, the natural gas pipelines and fracking issue, because there are community after community between Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Mercer County, have passed resolutions against this Penn East pipeline that's proposed. There's another one proposed for northern Jersey, but this is the one I'm focusing on because the chief campaign person for Senator Menendez is actually representing Penn East.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
He's a lobbyist for Penn East.
And he's the chief
He's not the campaign manager. There's a campaign chief or something like that for Senator Menendez. And this is information that just came out last week. It's not illegal what's going on. I'm not trying to say that. But is there...
It's questionable.
Yeah, and even the Sierra Club came out to say, yes, you know, if he really wanted to put his weight behind something, who knows what that would... He would have some more heft because of this lobbyist who works for him. So there's a pipeline there. There's oil trains going through northern Jersey, Teaneck, and other parts of Bergen County. It's all revolving around the need for sale of and transportation of fossil fuels. And so what we would need to do is roll all that back and rely on renewables, wind energy, solar energy. There are many examples of how this is working around the country. But again, it's like that. You can't prepare for war or prepare for peace and prevent war at the same time. It will have to create a mindset that this is the direction we're heading in. And one of the things that we would do with military contractors is work out a conversion plan so that people who are now working to produce the turbines for the airplanes and someone would have a job to go to when we pulled back from war. Same thing here. People working for dirty energy jobs, we would work out a conversion plan so that they would be able to work in producing solar power, wind power, generate, and that kind of a plan would generate more jobs than. So we don't want to put anybody out of work, but we need to shift from putting all of our energy in that direction and moving instead to renewables. So I would support anything, any piece of legislation, and would probably introduce legislation myself, where if you said, we're not going to build a hazardous waste incinerator here, we're not going to build it over here, we're not going to build it over here, or here, and there were no new hazardous waste incinerators built in New Jersey during the time that the grassroots environmental organization was in business. So you block up, sort of, you know, to put it crassly, you block up the toilet, you block out the places where this stuff can be disposed of, and you substitute another word for stuff, if you will. You block it back, you block it up here, 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 and here, then the manufacturer has to figure out how to make that same product without making those same wastes, because they don't have any place to burn them, dump them, incinerate them, or what have you. Similarly with plastics, if there's no end product that will be made out of plastics, then that means you need to figure out another method or another product that can handle the same kinds of things that plastics can, but with a much smaller impact on the environment. But you won't do that unless people stop you as manufacturers. It won't happen unless you're blocked from doing the things you've always done. And so while on the surface that looks like something small, if country after country or community after community block the use of plastic bags, plastic straws, or whatever it is, then you're ultimately affecting what the petrochemical industry is going to do and how they're going to use the resources. And maybe they're not going to be able to create something along those lines.
Okay.
And that's where the communities get power.
Yeah.
Is by blocking some of this stuff.
Now you had said, I want to tell you another thing, there's so many interesting things we're talking about, but you had talked about like the root of the problem. So why don't you tell us like what, you said it's not the root, right? What is the root? What is the nerve?
Oh, let's see, why do I always do that? Again, the nerve of it is corporate America, or big money, big corporations, Monsanto, DuPont, the large companies who, in the main, don't consider the price the complete price of the products they make. So they privatize, I'm sure you've heard this before, they privatize the profits, but socialize
the losses.
the
Sure.
losses.
Yeah.
So as a country, we absorb the loss through increased rates of cancer, increased other kinds of illnesses that come about through exposure to toxic waste or toxins in the environment. And then the workers at the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, they have one of the most hazardous kinds of jobs imaginable because they're exposed to the chemicals in production. So as long as the big companies are concerned more about their profits than they are about the impact of their production on their workers or the community, you're going to have this. This is one of the reasons why I'm a socialist, not a capitalist, not about people making as much money as possible just to make money. I'm not against people making money, but how do we decide what products are going to be made or what products are not going to be made, and how are we going to minimize the impact on all of us? And unfortunately, we've seen in the Congress, both the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, that more and more favor is being given to the companies themselves because their money flows through our political process like water. Just flows through, and if you're beholden to somebody, I was looking at Senator Menendez right now. I was looking at some of the money he receives, and this is on a political foreign policy matter first. He receives the most money from pro-Israel lobbyists of any senator in the Senate right now.
Wow.
I mean, at least for this campaign period.
Yeah.
He's received more. And in 2012, it was the same thing. So that's one. But then he also is right up there, I think number 15 out of 20, the top 20, in receiving money from lawyers and lobbyists. So and then we have Bob Hugin. I'm going to equal opportunity because Democrats and Republicans alike are guilty of this. He worked for Celgene, a pharmaceutical company, Bob Hugin, and we've had they're constantly in the papers arguing with each other about, well, how you're guilty of price gouging, Bob Hugin, and you're one to talk, Bob Menendez. Look what you did for your doctor friends. And I'm sitting there watching it go back and forth and saying, well, why don't we have a single-payer healthcare for all system so we don't get into those kinds of arguments? And then I read in that same article about the chief campaign person for Senator Menendez. One of his other clients is Blue Cross Blue Shield.
Yeah.
So Blue Cross Blue Shield, private health insurance companies, they're not interested in a public option. Remember, way back to the Affordable Care Act, public option got nixed over time. They're certainly not interested in single-payer, improved Medicare for all, and neither Bob Hugin nor Senator Menendez is calling for Medicare for all, or health care for all, or single-payer health care, and I am. I think it's important. I would introduce a companion bill to H.R. 676, which was the in-the-House Medicare for all bill. I would introduce a similar bill, or the same bill, in the U.S. Senate.
Okay, so yeah, and it's interesting because Medicare for all, we know, we've known it for a while, but now even the conservative studies have shown that it is the most economically feasible option, right?
Yes.
And really, people often don't really mention, but we have Medicare for all, right? Medicaid for seniors is Medicare for all, right? And it's efficient and it works, and it's worked for years, so it's an interesting thing. And kind of on that option, you mentioned twice now that you've identified as a socialist. So I am curious, do you identify, Marx in his version of socialism had 4 modes of production, right? You had slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and socialism or communism, whatever, that's social option essentially. But one thing he talked about a lot is he kind of frames them as singular systems. So each one has a set of rules that you go along with it. And he argued that when you transfer a mode of production, when you go from capitalism to socialism, it happens in a revolutionary manner, typically associated with violence. And Frederick Engel even argued the violence he argued. This is what they argued.
Right.
It is because the property owners would not release their property. So I guess my question is, because I've talked to a number of people who are socialists. I've known a number of the DSAs, and we've had some great debates. And I am curious: are you the school of thought that we need a sudden shift, or is your option more of like a mixed system fueled by more democracy, maybe like a socialized bottom and a middle, and then a socialized top, or something like that?
Well, definitely it has to be fueled by more democracy.
Okay.
And whether it's, I'm a little bit afraid of using the word incremental, because
all change is incremental.
little by little, because you see, and that's another reason why what makes 2018 different from 1998 when I last ran for U.S. Congress. And that is, in these days and times, the word socialism is not the kind of word that you necessarily run from. When I was organizing in the 90s, the 80s and 90s, if I used the word socialism, people would say, okay, thank you very much, slam the door in my face, and that's it. But today you see, starting with, maybe before that, but certainly starting with Bernie Sanders and the lead up to the 2016 election, identifying himself as a democratic socialist, going through Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and some other people who clearly identify as democratic socialists. The idea here is certainly no violence. The Green Party is all about nonviolence and not, against war, the only party that's against war. And so we're not into violent revolution. No, it would be nonviolent. And you see somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she won the primary. There's still her challenger, or the person she was challenging, Crowley. He's still on the ballot, I think, the Working Families Party. And there are people within the Democratic Party who are trying to pull her to the right. Because they don't think, if you're a Democrat, this is not what a Democrat can say. And so one of the other reasons I'm running is that for people like her, and there are many more today than there were 20 years ago, who are willing to say, I'm a democratic socialist, they need somebody in Congress who's going to pull them over more towards the left. Or sometimes labels like right and left and Marxist and socialist, they get in the way of talking about what we really want to see. And I think what we really want to see is a more equitable society. We don't want 48 million people uninsured. The Affordable Care Act, I benefit from that, but I don't know for how much longer I can, because the prices do keep going up. The solution isn't what the Republicans have, and Donald Trump have proposed, but there are real problems with this program, which is still very heavily subsidized by private industry. It was a windfall for the private health insurance industry. So that's not a sustainable long-term solution, in my opinion. And so to take the programs that are working and to expand them, that's part of what it means to me to be socialist, to want equal, not equal opportunity, but equal access and receipt of healthcare and other benefits like that.
I think you could argue for equal access to opportunity. I think the big criticism that people give to socialism is that I think is a bunk argument, but the argument is that some people will try to say equality of outcomes, right? Equality of outcomes doesn't make any sense, because there's always going to be the individual. You're not going to have a level playing field where everyone has the same effort and the same outcome, but equality of access to those opportunities.
Well, but that sounds very much like what we have today, and so I remember when I was running for in 1996 and 97, used to have debates within the Green Party, can capitalism have a human face? And there were people, we used to have intense arguments, who'd say, yes, problem is unfettered capitalism, and so it's eliminating people along the way, the competition is too steep, and there's a whole pool of people that can't make it, so let's make capitalism more human. I don't think you can do that, because the logic of capitalism is profit. And so we need to change the paradigm, if you will.
Sure.
We need to take it out of profit and put it into a situation. For example, when I was driving through Camden yesterday, we shouldn't have anybody homeless. Not in this country, not anywhere. The income gap between rich and poor in this country keeps widening. The income gap between the wealthier countries and the poorer countries keeps widening around the world. I think the last statistic I saw, 84 individuals, the top 84 in terms of income and assets, own more than the bottom half of the world's population. And we have 7 billion people, so that's 3.5 billion people. And you've got 84, 3 or 4 of whom are in the same family, who possess more wealth than 3.5 billion people. And that to me is, it's not about privilege, it's not about, oh, I'm more entitled to it than you. It's not about racism, oh, I'm a colonial power, and we conquered your country and now we have access to the resources. No, we have to look at it from the standpoint of we all are entitled to have affordable housing. We're all entitled to be covered under a healthcare system that takes care of what we need. We all are entitled to food, make sure we have enough to eat. There shouldn't be anybody hungry, there shouldn't be anybody homeless. And it's not about merit. It's not only about merit.
Sure. Yeah.
And because who determines merit? If we want to talk about institutionalized racism, there's all kinds of ways we can look at this. And I was talking to somebody today. We're citizens of the world, right?
Yeah.
We should be. We should think about that. I've traveled. I've had the opportunity. Been fortunate enough to travel to Syria, to Afghanistan, to Tunisia, to the West Bank, in Palestine. And especially with Afghanistan, here's a very quick example. Didn't want to raise money when I came back from Afghanistan because the organization I worked for was always raising money for the nonprofit purposes, what we were doing as a nonprofit organization. So I asked people, if we don't raise money, what can we do instead? And they said, well, the women are always looking for sewing supplies. So, okay, we started to ask people to contribute sewing supplies. In 2 years, we provided the women of Afghanistan in that area with 2.5 tons worth of sewing supplies. And you know where those sewing supplies came from in the main? A woman who wanted to make clothing for her grandchildren and never had a chance. So they were in the attic. The materials were stuck in the attic, or stuck in a spare room, or stuck in the basement. I'm not blaming any of these individuals because we have it, and we want to do things with it, and fine, you buy if you need, and hopefully you can use it. But I'm using that as an example because tucked away in our spare rooms, we had enough to keep the women of an area of Afghanistan sewing for 2.5 years.
Wow. And
so what else do we have? As a country, in one of the wealthier countries, what else do we have socked away that we don't even know we have until somebody asks us to look? Why does it take a catastrophe or a disaster?
So one thing I want to ask you, because this is like a tough question, but I think we should get into it, and I'd love to hear your response. Because typically with our society, just so you're aware, as you're aware with your profile, we don't feature the parties on the profile. It's just the person and the issues. But you've mentioned multiple times about being a Green.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Now, the Greens have come under some fire recently because some of the less scrupulous members have been taking money from... They've been there on the backs of, I believe, competitive parties. So they might run a race, and I think the logic behind it is that they'll run a race with the intention of splitting the progressive vote. And therefore weakening a single progressive candidate or a Democratic candidate or whatever in favor of a more conservative candidate. There was someone, I don't know their name, so I apologize, I read it. I don't even know if it's true, I just read it, right? So it's in the public consciousness. Right. And then there's some questionable things about Jill Stein, I think. So how does the organization as a whole deal with these things? Where does that, how does that impact you at all? Like, what is that kind of...
Yes and no. It impacts me because, and this was not something that I faced 20 years ago. I was never called a Russian troll or a Russian bot.
Yeah.
I was called a spoiler 20 years ago, and that's kind of what you're talking about there. But the issue of spoiler, there's so many different ways to address it. One is, I would start with saying that nobody is entitled to anybody else's vote. So if you're a Republican, if you're a Democrat, you have a constituency, but a Libertarian comes along and the Libertarian speaks more to the issues for you than the Republican does, then vote Libertarian. If you're a Democrat and a Green comes along and the Green speaks more to your issues than the Democrat does, vote Green. It's important, I believe, with everything I have, with all of my being, that there need to be more choices, not fewer, and that part of the problem that we face today is because people play a ping pong match, boing, 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 Republican, Democrat, and we're not free. People don't see themselves as free to make other choices. So we believe we're pushing something that Maine just passed for the second time called ranked choice voting.
Sure.
Which is increasing democracy. You asked about democracy before. Everything we talk about is dependent on increasing democracy, not stifling it. If we had ranked choice voting, then you go into the voting booth, anybody would go into the voting booth and they'd say, I really liked what that Green Party person had to say, but if I vote for her, then I'd be taking votes away from Senator Menendez, and Bob Hugin is going to win, and I don't want to see Bob Hugin win. So even if I support Madeleine Hoffman I agree with her platform, 95% of it, I can't vote for her. Mm-hmm. So, but if you had ranked choice voting, you'd go into the voting booth and you'd say, my number one choice is Madeleine Hoffman, my number two choice is Senator Menendez, or Bob Hugin, whatever it might be. And that way, when the votes are originally counted, if nobody gets more than 50% of the votes, because if you get 50% of the vote, then you win. But if nobody gets more than 50% of the vote, then everybody's second choices get attributed to their candidate of choice until one candidate gets 50% or more of the vote. It's not as complicated as it may seem. It's just something we're not used to doing. Some places, some municipalities do it. Maine is doing it now. And that kind of gets us out of this box of, I only have two choices. And I was involved in a discussion about this the other day on Facebook. If we had those choices, then what would be the incentive to pay somebody to come in and split the vote?
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
There would be no incentive. It would just vanish like that. Mm-hmm. So we need, again, as a society, we need to look at the way we're voting and figure out this winner-takes-all system just isn't working. We want ranked choice voting, maybe proportional representation. So if one political party gets 6% of the vote, they can get 6% of the representation in Congress. So you have these debates and you get out of that box. Republican,
Sure.
Democrat. And then the people in that box, Ralph Nader said it way back in 1996. He said, if you keep on voting for the lesser of two evils, you continue to get evil. And he said, and they get more evil and lesser, and lesser and lesser, because you get the political parties themselves figure they don't need to really respond to the people, because their constituents are going to vote for them no matter what they do. And so that's another reason why I'm running. I firmly believe that without another choice and another voice, we're just going to keep going down this pathway. As for the Russian stuff, guilt by association, I thought we dispensed with that in the 50s.
Sure.
With McCarthy,
Yeah.
where we learned that you can't go on these, you can't, you're a communist and you talk to these 10 people, they've all got to be communist too. There are a lot of things about that meeting that I've read and heard with Jill Stein. I don't want to go into the details because I don't really know.
Fair.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, but what I do know, and I was alive for a good chunk of the Cold War, but I didn't feel the impact of the Cold War very much because I was younger and I was learning about politics and such. But right now, what really bothers me the most is that if I or the Greens or anybody else has an anti-war position, first thing, oh, you must be Russian. You must have connections. I'm not being influenced by anybody from Russia. I am my own person. Or the Greens are their own political party. You have the Cold War and the McCarthy era, especially the McCarthy era. Most people would say they hope that never happens again. And so, I was having a conversation about this, and then I said, when I was asked, I was accused of being a Russian troll or a Russian bot because I was talking about how Senator Menendez and Senator Booker both had voted for the $717 billion military budget. Oh, that's a distraction. Why are you doing that? You're Russian this and Russian that. I said, but for the last 20 years almost, I've been saying this day in and day out. Yeah, that's who I am. You think that gives you instant credibility then? But this was a Democrat, and this was part of the, you see, I see a certain kind of liberal Democrat, if you will, circling the wagon, saying, we have to protect Senator Menendez at all costs because he's a Democrat. Not, these are, what his campaign chief are saying. Not, this is where some of his money comes from. Not, this is how he voted on the Iran deal, which he opposed. He was more in line with what the Israelis wanted, and that's not surprising given the money he receives. He hasn't come out to condemn the bombing of the school bus. Okay, so we're not looking at issues. We're not looking at where the politician stands on these issues. We're looking at political party label.
Sure.
And we've got to get beyond that. And I'm afraid that all of this anti-Russian stuff is muddying the waters so that people aren't looking directly at what the issue is and what the truth is on the issue. And one last thing, I just heard a really good analysis of fake news. Fake news the first time I heard that, I said, uh-oh, we're in big trouble because fake news is just something you disagree with. And then, who's deciding what's real news and what isn't? And I heard somebody say, no, all news has a bias. So you got to find the bias. And that's good enough for me. Rather than label it fake or label it pro-Russian or anti-American or whatever you want. What's the bias? Who's this? What is this program or policy designed to do? Who is going to benefit? Who is going to pay? Do I agree with the bias or do I not? But it's not fake.
Yeah.
It's just different. It's just different. And part of the problem, I think, and this has been happening slowly. I teach political science. I'm an adjunct professor of political science. Slowly over time, civility, the ability to carry on a discussion about our differences in policy, that's been erased little by little. So it's, no, I'm right, no, I'm right. And these two, the Republicans and Democrats, are fighting it out. Meanwhile, the rest of us, we don't have well-paying jobs. Minimum wage needs to be at least $15 an hour, but probably more. Probably more. We have students carrying terrible debt from their tuition. I teach at community colleges, so it's reduced tuition. But I've had students say, "I'm sorry, Professor Hoffman, I can't continue. I can't afford it." We have to get past the labels, is what I'm saying, and
Sure.
and the partisanship, and look at the issues, talk about the issues, talk to each other, and that, because otherwise, one of the classes I taught right after Trump was inaugurated, and within 30 seconds they were at each other's throats, and I said, "Whoa!" Because I asked them, "What do you see, in today's political landscape?" And they all said it was too divided.
Yeah.
And the classroom was evidence of that. Within 30 seconds they were almost at each other's throats, and we pulled back, and I learned something from that, and I changed the order around of what I taught and when I taught it. And the last day of class, we always have debates. And there were only 8 students in my class or something. And I was a little unsure whether they would want to do debates at all. And they said, "Oh yes, let's do them." And they each wanted to debate 2 topics. Not just one, but 2. And each debate turned into an hour discussion.
Mm.
But they did their debate, their back and forth, and then they sat around in a circle and kept asking each other questions. And they kept asking and answering, and there was no yelling, and there was no personal attacks. It was just, let's talk about it. And I left that night at the end of that semester saying, wow. From the first night where it was like a tinderbox, it was going to go up, we just want to know why you think that way, and how can we address this?
Sure.
So,
I think that's a really interesting point about the parties being limited, right? And I think that's kind of, that ties into the OurSociety Experiment. As you guys know, we don't list parties on the platform. You can check out Madeline Hoffman's platform on your virtual ballot in less than 30 seconds, right? It would take you everything there. Madeline's answered some of the value questions, so if you're busy, you can just see how you match with your specific values, basically on her platform. And here I do want to kind of wrap up our discussion. It's been really interesting, very expansive. But one thing about our society, right, is about increasing access and agency in the process, right? Okay. Access to candidates and information, and agency in the way that that when you're making a decision in that voting booth, you know that the data is behind your decision. You have a data-driven democracy, and you're making something that is not just on the surface, but much deeper about the decisions you're making in terms of, is it right? But for people at home, you've run for office now. This is your 3rd time, and fourth time, and you typically are outside the mainstream, so you typically have a more, I think, uphill battle because of the congestion and the intentional barriers to entry with the system. What would you say for someone at home who's watching this video? Your message resonates with them. They want to kind of get involved in office, and we don't have to go into too much detail, but just basically, what are some tips you would give them at home if someone wanted to run for office, on a platform that is similar to yours or even different, but just running for office? What would you recommend?
Well, I would recommend that they do it.
Okay.
That no hesitation, that people who want to run for office should run, but that they also understand what the political landscape is when they do, and that two things. One, there's something called clean elections that has been used in about 4 or 5 states, maybe more, and other options where they run without accepting the big money. Mm-hmm. Because once you accept the big money, you're really limited in terms of how much you can do and what you can say.
Okay.
You have to sort of make sure that the person or the company, corporation or PAC that gives you the big money, you have to make sure they're happy. Mm. And it's like coming out of school with a massive debt. Are you going to work for a nonprofit, or are you going to try to get a job where you can make back a lot of money every year so you can pay back your debt? You're going to owe a debt to somebody who gives you big money. Also, I would say, and I was just looking at some figures today, the percentage of people who voted in New Jersey, percentage of people eligible to vote who voted in the gubernatorial election, no more than 37%.
Yeah, it was 37. We wrote about that.
37%. That means 63% of the people stayed home. And I know, and I say this to my students too in my political science class, I ask them, what do you think of politics? I can't stand it. They're all liars. I'm turned off. They don't speak to me. And I say, I understand. I know what you're talking about. So what I would say to people who want to run, if all of us who didn't vote or who aren't registered as a Democrat or a Republican or even as a Green or a Libertarian, if we all created our own, if we came up with a party that reflected what we needed, call it a green wave if you will, but if we created a party that addressed our needs, then we have the power to take charge, really. We have the numbers. We have the numbers is what I mean. Yeah. We have the numbers to do it. So don't feel, what I would say is, please don't feel like you don't have a voice, because there's a lot of room out there. The Democrats and Republicans have sewn up, but 40%, if that, of the population eligible for voting, so eligible to vote. So there's a lot of room for alternatives, and that would be my advice. Don't turn off, close your door, stay in your room, watch video games all night, and don't get engaged.
Play video games.
Play video games, right. Watch videos and play video games. Get engaged with the political process, and hook up with people who care about addressing needs of people who are being ignored and left out of the process.
So that's a nice message, everyone. Madeline Hoffman, again, everyone, here at the OurSociety Experiment. You can check out Madeline's link to her OurSociety profile in the video below. We'll also place it in the description. Thanks so much for tuning in to this OurSociety's Candid Conversation. Madeline, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Great.
And I hope that I was informative.
I think so. I think we got a lot of information. I think it'll be very important for a lot of people. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.